Hey guys, Mr. Eschbacher here, talking about one of the most important topics in APUS history, and that's immigration. And today we'll talk about immigration through periods 1 through 7, which, as you know by now, you're sick of me saying it, is what's going to be on the 2020 APUS history test. Immigration is a great essay topic because College Board could hit it up for comparison, asking you to compare the experiences of different immigrant groups. It's perfect for continuity and change over time. You could even use it as causation in terms of showing a cause and effect relationship, how there was a reaction to different stages of immigration throughout American history. All right, let's get started here. Again, remember, it's all about the historical thinking skills. When we talk about historical thinking skills, you have to source your documents. Now, bear with me. I know we've done this before, but I'm giving this in the context, hey, look, there's a skill of immigration. So if we're doing historical context for documents in our hippos chart, ask yourself what was going on when the author wrote the document. Maybe you got a document from a guy who's a nativist and he's complaining about the all the immigrants and what he perceives as societal problems. And if you look at the date or the content of the document, you say, wow, the historical context. It's the 1840s and 50s, and there's a big wave of Irish and German immigration caused by militarism in Germany and the Irish potato famine. And there's a resurgence in nativism, groups like the Know Nothing Party. So, certainly, when you see a document, if it's about immigration especially, what's the context? Is it a union worker, a member of the Knights of Labor, complaining about the use of contract labor? Discuss how during this time period, you had an influx of new immigrants and how the Knights of Labor were one of the groups that supported the Chinese Exclusion Act. Again, when you have a document, your job is to use that part of hippos, the historical context, the intended audience, the point of view, or the purpose, to show how it proves part of your thesis. Make sure you're using vocabulary terms to explain the event. So don't just say he feels a certain way. Explain, look, when we talk about historical context, this act has just been passed, or this group of people is doing something. Think words in bold. And again, how does understanding this context help you interpret the source? Context creates bias. Context leads a person to form an opinion. If you're getting a very xenophobic, anti people from other countries point of view, and you see that it's during the 1920s or the first Red Scare, that context can then be used by you to explain that, hey, this is why this guy would have felt this way. That's what you're looking to do. Based on the historical context, why did the author write the gosh darn document? Intended audience. Who is the person or the group the author wants to inform or influence? Is that author asking the government to take action? Is he or she trying to rally public support behind something? How does this impact the author's message? There's a famous case about the Lincoln-Douglas debates when Abraham Lincoln ran against Stephen A. Douglas for the Illinois Senate seat in 1858. They had these 7 debates, and Illinois is a pretty vast state. The southern part of Illinois is basically in the South. So when Lincoln and Douglas had their debates in the southern parts of Illinois, it was almost kind of like whose neck was redder. But then as they moved further north, Lincoln became more of a free soiler and Douglas took a more moderate track. So if we're talking about immigration, who is this author trying to get a message across to? Is the author trying to ask Congress to pass a law restricting immigration? Is this an immigrant talking about their experience and asking for help to a specific group of people? Most importantly, look for point of view. Now, the problem is sometimes, guys, you just tell me what the point of view of the author is, but you don't use that golden word. What is the bias? Why did this person say something at this time? If somebody's criticizing immigration and you see that they are a member of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, you're going to tell me, okay, look, the Ku Klux Klan had a big resurgence. They increased their membership in the 1920s. If this is a document written from the point of view of a person who's been placed in an internment camp, explain their point of view, their perspective, their bias, because everyone has bias, regardless of whether or not it's positive or negative. That look, we feel like we are being unfairly treated, and explain why. What's the background of the author? If you know that your author of a document related to nativism is a member of the Know Nothing Party, then you need to explain that, look, this person's a member of the Know Nothing Party. They already have a bias against immigration. If this is a person who is an immigrant, they have a bias going, and they're trying to explain the reasons why they're doing something. If they're a business leader, what do they have to gain or lose? Well, a business leader wants to have cheap labor. Purpose. What was the author trying to accomplish with the document? Is the author trying to persuade people, warn people, demand something, question why? How does it affect the situation? If you're talking about reactions to immigration, maybe you see a document and it's a quote from the National Origins Act. Well, what's the purpose of that? To restrict immigration, but to specifically restrict immigration from the, quote, new immigrant countries of Southern and Eastern Europe. Outside information. Now, on the 2020 AP test, you have to give 2 really solid pieces of outside info. I would like you to try to see if you can get a third piece in there just in case they don't like your first 2. But understand, outside info doesn't mean a drive-by, guys. 1 sentence is not outside information. You want to really back it up, a real good, at least 2-3 sentences at least, and make sure you explain why that outside info is relevant to your essay. Better yet, connect outside information to 1 or maybe 2 documents and state, look, both of the historical context, rephrase that. You can gain a better understanding of these documents when looking at information beyond the documents. For example, blah, 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 blah. Explain the connection. Does the outside info show comparison, causation, continuity, and change? Last but not least, you have to have synthesis. You have to get that extra analytical point. So if a document connects to something outside the time period, but relevant to the essay in terms of a point of view, you've got a document from the Know Nothing Party, and you can now connect it to another time period, maybe something from the American Protective League, or you can connect it to an explanation of what caused the Zoot Suit riots or Japanese internment, then do it. Okay, your AP essay, in one way, shape, or form this year, you're going to have contextualization. Again, we've talked about this all year. You want to have a good, legit 3 to 4 sentences to start off your essay. Now, according to the College Board, contextualization is, and forgive me for my typos there, it's when you describe how there was a change or continuity before the historical development. If you are writing an essay about Gilded Age immigration, walk us back and talk about what the trends regarding immigration have been before the Gilded Age. Similarities and or differences. Now, the word contemporaneous means at the same time in different regions or geographical areas. If you're doing a Gilded Age immigration essay, pull back out and talk about how the government has taken a very pro-business approach. High protective tariffs, not much government regulation, being pro-business in strikes. And another example of this pro-business policy was that during the Gilded Age, the U.S. government had a very open and almost unrestricted immigration policy to provide cheap factory workers. Think the Star Wars intro a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Set up your thesis. And that's the other thing I have to say. When you do your contextualization, guys, you can't just puke out a bunch of stuff that happened before the essay prompt or happened at the time of the essay prompt. Tie it in somehow with, this is relevant for the essay prompt because. Don't use those exact words. Causation. If we're talking about immigration, and again, I'm trying to take these historical thinking skills and put them within the context of immigration. What are the cause and effect relationships that we see? What caused particular groups of people to come to the United States? We have a big influx of Irish and German immigrants in the 1840s and 50s. Why? Well, you have the Irish potato famine. You have militarism in Germany. The fact that you had an immigration movement that caused a reaction. If it's in the antebellum period, it leads to nativism and the Know Nothing Party. If it's in the Gilded Age, it's the American Protective Association. It's the Knights of Labor and other unions pushing for the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's In the 1920s, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, the first Red Scare, the National Origins Act, the Emergency Quota Act. Where do you see a cause and effect relationship? Are there multiple causes for this event? And if there are, give that priority. Say, look, yes, these are important causes because, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, this matters the most because it led to. Also remember, in some way, shape, or form, you can't have causes without effects. So if you're talking about how something caused an issue, follow it through to the other side. If you are telling me that increased industrialization in the Gilded Age led to a more open immigration policy, explain how it led to effects like nativism, hostility by labor unions, how these immigrants who came in here then experienced new problems living in urban America. Comparison. College Board over the years has loved this idea of comparison, making historical connections by looking at similarities and differences, making comparisons across time periods. And remember, guys, you can't have one without the other, similarities and differences. I have seen old AP essays where they ask you, compare the experiences of the old immigrants and the new immigrants in terms of demographics. Where are they coming from? Which parts of the world? Religions, in terms of their level of job skill, the ease with which they were able to assimilate, the types of nativism and opposition they faced, where they settled when they got to the United States. These are all really good comparisons, guys. Last but not least, continuity and change over time. Certainly something they could ask you when it comes to immigration. Over the course of American history, we see that immigration has changed significantly. The one continuity has been we have been a nation of immigrants. When these immigrants come in, however, although many of them are looking for opportunities, and although, quite frankly, they are doing so much to improve our nation, they're always facing some degree of nativism. Okay? Think about throughout American history. Have we been very open and welcoming for whatever reason? Or have we, built that wall or had the know-nothings or quotas or other types of restrictions on immigration? Remember, you can't have one without the other. Can't have continuity without change. All right. Now, I tried to go through each of the 7 time periods and give you examples of immigration. Honestly, the most difficult one was period 1 with the Age of Exploration because you have to do a little bit of a mental stretch. But if you're looking at immigration, the College Board wants you to have the context for European encounters. What was going on at the time to set the stage? The big contextual idea is, look, before the Europeans show up, there were complex civilizations already living in the Americas. They had adapted to their environment. They had extensive trade networks. They were thriving, highly complex, successful civilizations. And then the Europeans come. They also want the effects. Now, here's where you start to think of causation as a skill. Explain the effects of the development of the transatlantic voyages. All right, so setting the stage here. When we're talking about colonial immigration, guys, go back to 9th grade. What were the motives behind it? God, glory, gold. You have Spanish missionaries and other people who want to bring Catholicism. You have conquistadors like Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro who are looking for glory. You have the Spanish and the Portuguese especially who are driving this age of exploration to try to increase the amount of gold in their national treasuries to have more power. This immigration leads the Spanish trying to create their own version of a caste system in the New World, their own feudal society, by forcing Native Americans to work the land in the encomienda system. But as Native populations began to die off, a new labor source was brought in, African slavery. Slavery in of itself ties into immigration because it's a forced immigration. People coming from the West African coast or the Gold Coast having to endure the Middle Passage. Now, as a result of this migration in period 1, the Spanish create this class system where the people at the top, the native-born people from Spain, are the peninsulares, the highest class of people. People who are Spanish but born in the New World. Look at your impact of immigration. They're assigned a lower class, the Creoles. As a result of this immigration, you have cultural mixing. People who are part Spanish, part Native American were mestizos. People who are part Spanish, part African were mulattoes. The Columbian Exchange, another good example of the result of immigration. Disease is being spread. Smallpox, the flu, measles, chickenpox coming to the New World, smallpox especially, wiping out people. Disease is going back to Europe, like syphilis. New foods. The Europeans bring over grapes. They bring over wheat. Why? So they can make sacramental wine and Holy Communion wafers. Europeans bring sugar over. New foods coming back from the New World. The turkey, corn, blueberries, new animals. The Europeans bring pigs, cows, horses, and most importantly, a massive transfer of wealth. Uh, Europe becomes incredibly enriched, and you see the result is mercantilism. All right, moving into period 2, another time period with immigration. College Board wants you, again, always to think context for a time period. When you get that essay topic, think based on that time period. What's the context? What are the big picture ideas? Well, in period 2, if we're talking about immigration, we see that Europeans developed a variety of colonization and migration patterns. In other words, the Europeans settle in different places for different reasons. They have different goals. They create different cultures. It's, the idea of colonial North America is kind of a false statement. It's very diverse based upon what European nation does it. Wherever they go, they compete with each other and they compete with Native Americans for resources. College Board wants you to realize that when you talk about the British in particular, the British are the most successful colonizing the New World because they get the most immigrants. They bring in the largest number of male and female immigrants. They even bring in immigrants from the rest of Europe, yes, mainland Europe, to settle in the British colonies for different reasons. People who are looking for a start in terms of social mobility. The number one reason people came to the New World was economic prosperity, religious freedom, better living conditions, and they were primarily agricultural. And this is going to lead to them having clashes with Native Americans whose land they're taking. If you think about it, the reason the British win ultimately in North America is they do a better job at bringing immigrants over. These different European groups, not just in terms of New Spain, New France, New Netherlands, but even within the British Empire, lead to a brand new type of culture. You have what's called cultural pluralism, not a melting pot, but within a society you can see clearly different groups of people. In New York, we have British people, we have the Dutch, we have African slaves, Native Americans, we have French Huguenots. In Pennsylvania, the quote Pennsylvania Dutch, they're actually Germans. The middle counties in particular were diverse. And the fact that you had so many different groups and bringing in new ideas, like George Whitefield coming over as part of the First Great Awakening, bringing over European Enlightenment ideals, it makes a more blended culture in colonial times. One of the reasons you don't see one religion dominating in colonial America is the fact that there are so many religions that other than the Puritans in Massachusetts, you can't see one religious group really dominate. Some key vocab we can think of. Now, George Whitefield, you might not think immigration, but remember, George Whitefield was from Ireland. So it's not a direct immigration thing, but you can say, look, immigrants like George Whitefield helped stoke the first. Sorry about that. I can't believe I wrote Second Great Awakening. Mentioned that immigration during this time period comes from various regions. Within British colonial America, yes, you have people from Britain. You have the Scots-Irish. You have people from mainland Europe. You have people settling in all kinds of different regions, the St. Lawrence River Valley by Quebec. The Dutch settle what we now call New Amsterdam, New York. They settle Pennsylvania. They settle New Jersey, Delaware. And of course, the British heavily are in the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard. Talk about reasons why people immigrated. Remember, always remember, the number one reason for immigration during this time period is economic opportunity. Colonies like Jamestown were founded as joint stock companies. In other words, corporations were creating colonies to make a profit. Heck, even the Pilgrims, when they arrived in Plymouth, their voyage was funded because they created a joint stock company and got people to invest, promising that they would make money. Also, there was a shortage of labor in colonial America. So you had a very strong economic reason to get to the New World if you could, because you could get higher wages in colonial America than you could in the rest of Europe. Other reasons. Some people came because of debt or crimes they had committed. Remember James Oglethorpe settling Georgia. The British created policies to encourage immigration, like the headright system that said you get 50 acres of land if you paid your own way. And if you paid for other people, you got more land. This led to people called indentured servants signing contracts from 4 to 7 years in an effort to get people to come over. It also, as a result of this immigration, led to very stratified class differences in Virginia. And of course, religious reasons. The Pilgrims or the Separatists in Plymouth, the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay who came there wanting to create a city on a hill, Catholics in Maryland, the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Think about impacts of this immigration period too. Hector St. Jean Crevicer, who we'll talk about later on, writes a document about, quote, this new American. He's not just from the British Isles. You see religious diversity, not domination by one group, because there are so many different religious groups. And again, the impact of these transatlantic exchanges. Enlightenment ideas come over from Europe. George Whitefield, one of the preachers of the First Great Awakening. All right, now we're moving into period 3. Now, when we do period 3, if we're talking about contextualization, guys, we're looking at the context of American independence. Any topic in period 3 has to somehow relate back to this idea of here are the events that cause or the events that are results from the American Revolution. We also want to talk about how American society was affected by the Revolution, the influence of immigration on the Revolution, but also on American politics and society after. So, key ideas. As increasing numbers of immigrants came into North America and other parts of the world, they moved westward. The more people came in, the more crowded it got, and even in colonial times prior to the Revolution, people were pushing out along the frontier. This is going to lead to tensions, especially, remember, when the British create that Proclamation of 1763 and try to stop Western settlement. Guys, Thomas Paine immigrated from England right at the onset of the American Revolution. And in 1776, he wrote Common Sense, one of the most important documents to get people to the Patriot cause. After the Revolution, you get the French diplomat, Edmond Genet, who comes over here. He's not really an immigrant, but he's trying to rally people to support France against Great Britain, and he causes all kinds of problems for Washington. In fact, there were quite a few people who were recent immigrants in the 1790s, and they tended to join Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. What's that matter? Well, part of the Alien and Sedition Acts had a thing called the Naturalization Act, which made it harder to become a U.S. citizen. It increased the amount of time from 5 years up to 14 years and made it easier to deport immigrants. Why? Because the Federalist Party wanted to silence members of Jefferson's party. Now we're into period 4. Again, guys, this is the age of Jefferson through the age of Jackson. It starts with Thomas Jefferson's election in 1800, and it ends with the end of the Mexican War and the end of James K. Polk's administration. This is also as America begins to grow. Contextualize this. We are growing and developing. It's like our teenage years in the Republic. An American politics, economy, foreign policy, in some way, shape, or form, develop this idea of what it means to be an American. And if you're going to do that, you have to address the question of what role in this new America do immigrants play. You've got tons of international migrants, meaning immigrants, coming into the United States, and they're primarily going to the northern cities that have factories. Others are moving west of the Appalachians. I like to think about places like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, heavy German population. Chicago, heavy Irish population. A lot of those places in the Midwest that have great food, you see heavy German and Irish population. In St. Louis, Anheuser-Busch. Guys, that's a German name. They're headquartered there. For a while in Chicago, it seemed like you couldn't be the mayor of the city unless you were Irish. Okay? We're talking about the old immigrants, people coming from Northern and Western Europe. Again, think cold places like Ireland and Germany, blonde hair, blue eyes. The majority of these immigrants were Catholic, but they were also Protestants. And it was the Catholic immigrants especially who'd get the most nativism. They either moved to northern cities to work in factories or they moved out west. Many of them were skilled workers. They were also unskilled factory workers. In general terms, the old immigrants, the people who come here before the Civil War, had more job skills than the new immigrants, the people who came in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Because their language, their religion, and their job skills were more similar to native-born Americans, they had an easier time assimilating into American culture than the new immigrants. Now, that doesn't mean they don't face nativism. We know that they did. You can connect these immigration patterns to different trends in American history. During period 4, in the early parts of it, after the War of 1812, you get the market revolution, America's early industrial revolution. And these immigrants are going to be the cheap factory labor. In fact, the Irish especially will replace the, quote, Lowell girls and other places that employed women. You can connect them to manifest destiny. You can say that there are reasons for expansion. As the population of the country grew, there's more pressure for people to move west. Point out that some groups of people, again, think the Germans, moved out west to escape nativism, and because you had as much available land. Politics. During this time period, more and more of these immigrants are going to join the party of Thomas Jefferson rather than the Federalists. Why? Well, Jefferson especially, he's very pro-French, and you're going to see a lot of people coming in the early time period of period 4 from areas there. Later on, they're going to join the Andrew Jackson's Democrat Party. Why? Well, the opposition to the Democrats, the Whigs, they're the ones who are going to push for a lot of these antebellum reforms. And they're the ones who are going to push for temperance, banning alcohol. They're also going to be the ones who really kind of start the idea of nativism. In fact, one group breaks off from the Whig Party in the 1850s and forms the Know-Nothings. You can connect them to antebellum reform movements. As you had increased immigration from Catholic countries, Ireland and Germany, pro-temperance advocates became more and more active, and they really stereotyped Irishmen especially as being drunks, Germans as drinking too much. Even Horace Mann, the guy who created the big push for public education in the United States, you see it's going to actually lead to the Catholic school movement in America. Why? Because the most common book used during this time period was what was called the McGuffey Reader. And the McGuffey Reader, in addition to teaching math and reading and writing, had very kind of Protestant messages. And that would lead to, at mid-century, an increase in Catholic schools. Now we're moving into period 5. Again, do your contextualization, guys. What's the context of this time period? It's the causes and effects of the Civil War, sectional conflict. We see immigration ties in with this. We also have a historical thinking skill here. Compare the importance of the Civil War on American values. The idea that the Civil War is going to reassess what it means to be, quote, an American. That includes immigrants. We're also going to see that immigration played a key role in helping the North win the Civil War. So again, this is the heaviest time period of immigration from the, quote, old countries, especially in the 1840s. You have the Irish potato famine. That means you have increased nativism. The know-nothings get created in the 1850s. But you also start to have more immigration from Asia. Remember, later on, it'll be the Chinese immigrants and the Irish who are the two main groups building the Transcontinental Railroad. We'll see that America's two-party system began to break down over issues like slavery and immigration. The nativists form a political party called the Know-Nothings, and they take their membership from the old Whig Party. In fact, in 1856, the Know-Nothings nominated former President Millard Fillmore, a Whig, as their candidate. You can connect immigration to what happens during the Civil War. In 1863, you had the New York City draft riots, which were primarily Irish immigrants lashing out and angry about the Civil War, about what they called a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. Because remember, guys, people could buy their way out of the draft by paying $300 or by hiring a substitute. And Copperheads especially would rouse up the Irish saying, hey, you're going off fighting and dying and getting drafted in a war that's going to free slaves, and they're going to come take your jobs. big picture ideas. The fact that the North has such an industrialized economy and needs more immigrants to have cheap labor for the factories gave the North a gigantic population advantage. At the time of the Civil War, there were 20 million people in the North and only 9 million people in the South. And that becomes one of the reasons why the North wins. I mean, think about simple math. If we have a fight and I've got more people on my side, guess what? I win. Period 6. This is the mother of all times for immigration. Guys, this is what we think of when we think of Ellis Island and stuff like that. Again, contextualize, guys. This is the time period of big business, of industrial capitalism. And we're going to see that immigration increased the population of cities, of urban areas, helped create a new national culture, but also had big economic impacts. We need more immigrants in the United States. We encourage immigration. It makes our population more diverse. It also increases the population of cities because immigrants seeking to kind of be together settle in what are called ethnic islands or ghettos. And these cities become hubs of very diverse populations. You know, every city in America has a little Italy, a Chinatown. Many of these immigrants come here for different reasons: to get away from poverty, religious persecution, to get better economic opportunities. Some come on a basis of what's called contract labor. They sign an agreement to show up, work, and then go back home. Now, immigration plays a lot into the character of American cities. Again, with this idea of more diverse cultures in the ghettos, in the ethnic islands. But it's also going to lead to problems because you have more and more people coming into these cities as they grow, and these cities don't have proper facilities to deal with this. You don't have social welfare systems. You don't have good sanitation. You have poor immigrants being taken advantage of in sweatshops who are being chastised, who are being hated by different nativist groups like the American Protective Association, who have unions targeting them because they don't want competition taking away their jobs. You have people living in the dumbbell tenements in the slums. You have political machines really kind of counting on the support of immigrants, kind of using them to stay in power and do their corrupt political practices. You also have this big debate over assimilation. What does it mean to be an American? You know, there was a play during this time period that first brought up this idea of America as a melting pot, that supposedly as each immigrant group came in, they would blend in, give up their own individual cultural traits, and become an American. In reality, we know that's not the case. America is not a melting pot. You can tell who's of Irish ancestry. You can tell who's of Latino ancestry. In reality, it's a term we like to use called cultural pluralism, or as I heard one historian say, it's like a salad bowl. You can mix those ingredients in the salad bowl all you want. A tomato is a tomato. Lettuce is lettuce. You already still know it is, but they're a part of something new. I told you there's a lot of immigration for period 6. Many immigrants had to figure out how they could compromise keeping their culture and Americanizing themselves, changing their last names, or trying to show their patriotism. Many people, especially middle-class women, tried to help the problems faced by these new immigrants. Jane Addams, as you know, was one of the leaders in the settlement house movement. She founded Hull House. Artwork during this time period. We talked about the ash can school. Very often would feature immigrants. There were people during this time period who had different versions of what America should be. The social gospel movement. The idea that as a Christian, it's your duty to be your brother's keeper and help the poor. Very often targeted, trying to help immigrant groups. And again, the political machines. Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, other political machines in different cities, stayed in power by providing welfare services to poor workers and especially immigrants, which unfortunately then made the immigrant groups targets of, hatred, derision, people thinking that they were the reason there were political machines. A couple key ideas. We talked about the melting pot versus cultural pluralism. The new immigrants, where do they come from? They come from Southern and Eastern Europe. Think places like Poland, Russia, Greece, Italy. If your last name ends in a vowel or it's got a funky spelling, hey, who's that Duke basketball coach? Mike Krzyzewski. You're a new immigrant. Oh, wait, I can't say Matuszewski. We got to talk about Syracuse. Religion. Yes, you still have lots of Catholic immigrants, especially places like Italy, but you also have more Jewish people, more Orthodox Christians. So religiously, they're different. In terms of appearance, they're different. They tend to have less job skill than the old immigrant groups. Linguistically, they're different. They have a much more difficult time assimilating. And immigrant groups come here, they're screened. They're not welcomed at Ellis Island. Ellis Island was used to try to screen and see if they could disqualify people from coming in. Angel Island was the Pacific Coast version of that, especially with the Chinese. And you saw a lot more people being rejected in Angel Island, look at your anti-Asian bias, than Ellis Island. Labor, again, we talked about how immigrants would be used as contract labor. Come in, work for a designated amount of time, go back home. In northern cities, immigrants would often be used as scabs or replacement workers if workers were locked out or on strike. We talked about how immigration received stiff opposition from unions like the Knights of Labor. Political machines, we talked about. The dumbbell tenements. There were people who looked to try to address issues of urban problems, whether it was immigrants or other poor people, like Jacob Riis, who we'll talk about again in period 7. Remember, Jacob Riis wrote How the Other Half Lived. Photography. He took pictures of the slums and the dumbbell tenements. We talked about Jane Addams and Hull House. Examples of nativism from period 6. The American Protective Association was the Gilded Age version of the Know-Nothings. Unions like the Knights of Labor. Passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The literacy test. In the 1890s, members of Congress tried to pass a literacy test, and it was vetoed by President Grover Cleveland. Period 7, 1890 to 1945. Why 1890? Some historians start the Progressive Era in 1890. 1945 brings us to the end of World War II. Think about contextualization. This is the time period that marks America growing into its role as a world power. We talk about major events, 2 world wars, the Progressive Era, imperialism, the Roaring '20s, a Great Depression, and you can tie immigration into all of them. That you have economic pressures, global events, and politics that are going to change policies towards immigration. That door swings open, that door swings closed. It's going to change attitudes about nativism. Think about the muckrakers. Again, reference Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. Also, Upton Sinclair. Guys, when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle in 1906, he didn't write it because meat was gross. He wrote it because he was trying to advocate socialism. He wanted to draw people's attention to the plight of poor workers. In The Jungle, most of the characters are recent immigrants, people from places like Lithuania. So he's trying to drum up support for that. It's just that people got grossed out. And the old Sinclair quote was, "I aimed for their hearts, but instead I hit their stomachs." Lots of different restrictions or hatred or xenophobia during this time period. We talked about World War I, how anything German was forbidden. Hamburgers became Liberty steak. Sauerkraut was Liberty cabbage. You had a case of the Liberty measles. German languages were banned in public schools. German composers, you couldn't play them. Then after World War I, fear of communism spreading from the Russian Revolution led to more fear of immigration. People went through the first Red Scare. You had the Palmer raids in 1919 that led to the deportation of hundreds and hundreds of immigrants. Nativists during the Progressive Era used immigration as a way to push for other reforms. They wanted quotas. They wanted stuff like the Emergency Quota Act, the National Origins Act. Those in the 20s. During the Progressive Era, though, you got ladies like Margaret Sanger, the lady who founds Planned Parenthood. One of the arguments she made for birth control was, quote, "These immigrants are overrunning us." We talked about the eugenics movement earlier this year. Some terms for period 7. Social Darwinism. Remember that for survival of the fittest. It would be applied to different racial groups as well as a justification why later on maybe restrictions would be made against certain immigrant groups. Eugenics, Margaret Sanger, Jacob Riis. During World War I, the Germans were called Huns. Fear of foreigners, also called xenophobia. 1920s restrictions on immigration, like the Emergency Quota Act, the National Origins Act, or just examples of nativism. Sacco and Vanzetti being convicted and executed, even though the evidence against them was circumstantial. The resurgence of the KKK when they decided they were going to be anti-immigrant. Even temperance and prohibition. Again, these white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are the people who push for prohibition, and they target the wets, people who are recent immigrants, people who are Catholic. We talked about the Red Scare, and then moving into the 1930s and 40s. The Bracero program, created by the United States to bring in migrant workers during World War II to work in the farms. It led to nativist outcry and backlash, like the Zoot Suit riots. Executive Order 9066 that led to the internment of Japanese Americans in the Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus the U.S. If I have to try to narrow down potential topics for the AP test, guys, immigration's a big one. I hope this helped you. And for now, log off and plug in your Chromies, homies.